I really hate following that keynote address we heard. I won't have funny jokes in mind, I don't think. I'll try and I'll see what I can slip in. But in this presentation, I'd like to address some aspects of a conundrum that I see in fostering the development of intercultural competence in an instructed setting. And I'll offer, hopefully, some proposals for how at least we in Irvine and some colleagues of mine and I are trying to unravel that conundrum, if it's even possible. And what I present is a synthesis of several strands of scholarship that have gained increasing attention in applied linguistics in recent years, but in my view have not made their way systematically into language programs and classrooms, particularly in the US. So I hope that what I present hopefully is channeling several voices in the field and is not merely derivative, to use that nasty word, and that I think I'm addressing a lacuna in applying, I'm using that word quite intentionally as an applied linguist, the most useful aspects of this difficult and contested term for language pedagogy and for assessment. So, come on. Okay. I don't know why this is not working. There we go. Okay. So first I want to say a few words about the concept itself. I think we're all enjoying doing that here. For which we actually have, I would optimistically say, a wealth of terms and ideas. And then I'll briefly detail the dilemma that I see in applying intercultural competence to pedagogy and assessment, which may help account for why it's so unevenly and poorly applied in classroom settings. And then I want to call attention to a few models that we have for instruction, particularly in introductory and intermediate university instruction in the US, which is the world in which I grapple with these ideas. And I'll finish up with a look at a model of assessment that I think is very promising for working out the pedagogical dilemma of teaching intercultural competence. For some reason my button's not working. Okay, so the first part. So as Sinecrope, Norris, and Watanabe have recently pointed out, though they're certainly not the only ones to do so, we have no shortage of terms and concepts to describe the ostensible object of that part of higher education that is intended to help bridge cultural divides, facilitate communication across assumed cultural boundaries, and ultimately make the world a better place. These are the terms that the authors list. They have them in nice, neat columns. I thought they were better like this. And Sinecrope and colleagues write that what all of these terms attempt to account for is the ability to step beyond one's own culture and function with other individuals from linguistically and culturally diverse backgrounds. I feel especially uncomfortable saying that after our keynote this morning, or quoting that, and I'm sure if John Norris were here, he'd feel the same way. What I think is very important is to delineate between the many uses of that primarily encompass appropriate attitudes and behaviors in a given situation, whatever that means, and those that are intended as implicit or explicit targets of educational activity. And the terms seem to be used in both. In their analysis, Sinecrope and colleagues, of course, discuss and critique Byram's model of intercultural communicative competence, as well as its updates by Reisager, Diaz, and others that view the concept as a complex of declarative knowledge, communicative skills, and perspectives ostensibly gained through instruction and real-world experience, and the model is set up as the target of instruction and of assessment. Importantly, what this and several other models assume is the existence of a target culture that can be identified and taught in classroom settings. One term is absent from Sinecrope and colleagues' list, which I think is helpful, actually conspicuously absent from their discussion, which I think is helpful to a more critical understanding of intercultural competence that can perhaps be applied to language pedagogy and assessment, namely Gramsci's notion of symbolic competence. Gramsci asserts that it is no longer appropriate to give students a tourist-like competence to exchange information with native speakers of national languages within well-defined national cultures. They need a much more sophisticated competence in the manipulation of symbolic systems. Language learners are not just communicators and problem solvers, or to quote another book that I like very much, not just talking heads that produce output, but whole persons with hearts, bodies, and minds, with memories, fantasies, loyalties, identities. In the introduction to the 2014 Modern Language Journal issue that Claire Crumpsch edited, she also framed this imperative that is framed here and put here in 2008 in global perspective, asserting that the demands of globalization need to be able to engage, students need to be able to engage across boundaries and across interpersonal, subjective, interpersonal, and digital divides, and that these should be at the heart of language education. At this point, I'm risking spending too much of my talk on just defining the parameters and nature of intercultural competence, a net into which many language professionals have been ensnared, I'd say. But I also need to bring in Liddicoat and Scarino's recent framing of the intercultural, which I think synthesizes quite nicely its most useful sociocultural and dynamic interpretations, as well as leaves space for various interpretations in situated educational contexts. I focus not on their full list, but enough of it for our discussion here. After a critique of the cultural as the static, essentialist, and limited focus of much teaching and learning in classrooms today, they regard the intercultural taking place in which languages and cultures are the sites of interactive engagement. Intercultural communication happens. It is not an entity that can be just simply fixed or delineated. And next, it necessarily implies the transformational engagement of the learner. Change happens for one or more parties, and communication and change involve multiple possible interpretations. Intercultural understanding is not abstract, though applied linguists may often discuss it as if it were. It is embodied practice, which aligns very well as how Claire Crumpsch has been describing it for many years now, which means that, again, that intercultural communication and understanding only happen in the world and in context. In good postmodern fashion, borders between the self and others are explored, problematized, and redrawn. And for Liddicoat and Scarino, drawing a line back through Byram and probably all the way back to Del Hymes, the intercultural is more than just awareness. It necessitates acting. And as such, the learner is both analyzer and participant in interaction. The learner is a legitimate participant in a cultural world in which the new language for that person is a new language is being used. So now we come to the core dilemma indicated in the title of my talk, the conundrum of intercultural competence, language pedagogy, and assessment. Once we've established the nature and scope of the target, as I've hopefully done here, if only too briefly, we come to the dilemma to perhaps inappropriately, actually definitely inappropriately, borrow from discussions of physics, cosmology, or maybe science fiction. We have the problems of space and time. So, considering space, unless symbolic competences are being taught and learned in the environment in which the language and culture are part of everyday activity outside the classroom, the sorts of intercultural learning students are expected to do necessarily happen at a physical and geographical remove, mediated through instructional materials, authentic cultural products, perhaps digital communication, perhaps even with speakers of the new language, and interaction with the instructor and fellow students, of course. Now, what I think is often just as problematic is that mediated vicarious intercultural learning takes place, in a sense, through double or triple mediation, as level-appropriate materials are carefully selected and didacticized based on the knowledge, preferences, and ideologies of the curriculum designer and the classroom teacher, calling into question, in my view, the authentic nature of the intercultural experience and learning from the get-go. For real intercultural experiences, if there is such a thing, learners may have in the world are extremely difficult or impossible to simulate or script, even in coursework abroad, due to their contingent, fragmented, and fleeting nature, even if they comprise the very fabric of semiotic and social activity in the new language. So I realize I'm setting up kind of my own Gordian knot here. As educational linguists, such as Van Leer have shown us, every pedagogical context is necessarily an abstraction from reality, and developing intercultural competence through these doubly mediated means is problematic for those of us who try and design curriculum and teach students in classrooms. To add another wrinkle to this dilemma, when we're talking about introductory or intermediate language instruction, the problem is particularly crass, for as we know, the syllabus of most such courses in higher education settings is communicative, but still largely grammar and skills driven, based on fairly straightforward transactional communication settings. The idea of achieving the sorts of competences and capabilities I detailed before are most often reserved, if ever, for later semesters or years, or for study abroad sojourns, presumably. This, of course, is one of the central complaints of the much discussed 2007 MLA report. So this is a problem of space, of the bald fact that even with the injection of the benefits digital media and communication bring to language teaching in the last generation, the instructional setting is spatially removed and even doubly removed from the ostensible aim of intercultural learning. The problem of time is, however, perhaps more insidious and problematic, for what studies of study abroad contexts as well as naturalistic L2 learning have shown us is that the development of intercultural competence and its various definitions takes a lot of time. And if we follow Fred Dervin's interpretation this morning, one's whole lifetime, really. And one thing we often, actually always, don't have in university programs is sufficient time. And finally, a clear dilemma of both space and time, as I've framed it, is of course assessment. Hundreds, if not thousands, of scholars in numerous fields, including education, international business, political science, and of course applied linguistics, have offered instruments and frameworks for assessing intercultural competence in its various definitions and manifestations. I'll come back to this one in the last section, but the core problem is the identification and measurement on appropriate timescales of specific outcomes and assigning, of course, grades that matter for students' coursework. So, all too briefly too, I want to move on to a term that I've been using a lot. So far, I think that what I've offered is what I call a glass half empty, kind of a pessimistic interpretation of the problems of facilitating intercultural competence in an instructed setting. And if I were to stop right here, the conclusion would probably be that we shouldn't try it at all because it's hopeless. I think that was part of the message of the talk this morning, but I came away kind of uplifted, so I don't think that was ultimately the purpose. But in fact, what I've offered, I think, is hopefully more of a reality check than a lament for the impossibility of the task, because unless we have a realistic and honest understanding of what it is we're trying to do, it'll be doomed to fail or come up short from the beginning, and actually it usually does fail, right? I suggest that if framed in an ecological approach, the language classroom is as ideal as a sojourn abroad for at least laying the foundation for developing intercultural competence, and in fact may help ensure a more likely development of the various ways we understand intercultural competence should a student have a sojourn of that sort. So in terms of an ecological approach to language teaching and learning, we have a wealth of scholarship, though arguably not much of it has focused on teaching. A lot of it has focused on research and on language forms, which is fine. Most of it has looked at functions and forms of language in a whole range of settings, some of which have been pedagogical, and it's been research into sort of language development more than teaching. Kamsch's concept of symbolic competence that I mentioned before, in a hybrid understanding together with Liddicoat and Scarino's framing, is the foundation, which Kamsch sees as entailing the production of complexity. Maybe we need to reframe it in terms of simplexity, the tolerance of ambiguity, and form as meaning rather than as a precursor to it or something that is merely mapped onto. The aim, she writes, is to lead teachers to view language and culture, that is grammar and style, vocabulary and its cultural connotations, texts and their points of view as inseparable. No easy task when you're trying to design curriculum. In turn, language learners should slowly understand that communicative competence does not derive from information alone, but from the symbolic power that comes with the interpretation of signs and their multiple relations to other signs. What I don't have here is one of the solutions she offers is actually through contested, conflicted cultural products such as literature. So for Crumpsch, this means engaging the literary imagination. That in the classroom we should, from the start of instruction, employ literary and other cultural products so that learners can communicate not only with living others, but with imagined others, and with other selves they might want to become. And I'll emphasize here this notion of imagination, and imagination being closely linked to things like compassion, that are largely absent from many curricula, especially introductory and intermediate level university language curricula. Fortunately, we do not have to invent the wheel or reinvent the wheel. No, it would be inventing the wheel. Though, as language professionals, we do have to take up and critically apply frameworks that we do have at our disposal. Most promising, I think, are found in the multiple literacies models of Richard Kern and the recent work of Pisani, Willis, Allen and Dupuis, Swaffer and Ahrens, of course, and others who have taken a literacies approach to language teaching and learning. They are also available in genre-based models based on the tenets of systemic functional linguistics, largely, that have been offered by Heidi Burns and Hiram Maxim, Sprang and Crane, and several others who've been writing on this very intelligently for the last dozen or so years. And they're being worked out even as we speak, over the last few years by my colleague Alison Phipps and me, in terms of what we have been calling a human ecological pedagogy, which aims to bring complexity, contingency, conflict awareness, and mediation, and utterly compassion into the language curriculum, into teaching practice, and into assessment. So I'm just giving an indication there. I'm happy to talk with others about that, and that would be a whole presentation itself. But I want to spend the last bit of my time on this issue that actually we either avoid entirely in discussions of this usually, or give cursory treatment to, or totally miss the target in terms of going back also to the original construct we're even trying to assess. So I'll turn to this part of the dilemma for the last part. So assessing intercultural competence is similar to assessing other aspects of language and other aspects of learning, such as the formal features of language in its overall concern with validity and reliability. And as McNamara, as well as Lantoff and Poner discuss it, generalizability is what we're often aiming for. The problems with generalizability or standardization of any aspect of language and culture learning, according to Poner, and citing also McNamara, is that performance is assumed to be a direct outcome of an individual's competence, rather than the result of interactions among individuals and their available resources. And here competence, as they discuss it, and I understand it too, is often regarded as something that is fixed, even in the moment, even if you're looking at a snapshot, that the competence is a fixed thing even at that moment. So in my framing of intercultural competence as complex, dynamic, and multi-directional between learner and those in the new language environment, however, valid, reliable, generalizable assessment would appear to be impossible. And the indication from Professor Dervin's talk today kind of suggests that too, that assessment is a big problem, if not impossible. The problem is made stickier by the ways that intercultural competence has traditionally been measured. As Sinecrope and colleagues describe, we have a bevy of assessment instruments for this construct in its various definitions. Many of them are indirect assessments. I would even suggest most of them are probably indirect assessments in the form of questionnaires or intercultural competence inventories. And some of them are direct assessments, what are known as direct assessments, in that they present the learner with scenarios and they are asked to role play or simulate what they would do in that situation. Oversimplifying, I mean, there's other direct assessments such as portfolios that have been used, longitudinal assessments of that sort. So I am oversimplifying what are many quite sophisticated instruments, and I don't want to diminish their value or importance in their context, but that is the essence of it, and the direct approach may appear to be more in line with classroom teaching and curriculum design, as one could design a curriculum in which learners work through such situations, and in fact there are many examples of that, and similar ones that can be used as assessments to determine how well the student has developed intercultural competence. The problem we encounter, though, is one of validity, in my view, the extent to which such instruments can ever capture, simulate, or emulate real-world situations, or whether they merely play out or even perpetuate stereotypes or essentialized versions of the target language and culture, for whether how a learner would respond to a situation at one given time is likely never the same as they would react to the same situation at another time. And yet we, teachers, aim to assign grades upon which the student's education, career, law school, medical school, etc. are all dependent for their performance at time one there, or time one and time two, even if it's multiple snapshots over time. And then we decide whether they have, as was indicated too by Professor Durbin, we stand up on high and determine how appropriately they have, culturally appropriately they have fulfilled the task. So one way out of this dilemma that I've sketched very quickly is to adapt a sociocultural model of assessment, which has been developed by Poner and Lantoff over this last decade or so, which they call dynamic assessment. They point out that dynamic assessment is neither an assessment instrument nor a method of assessing, but a framework for conceptualizing teaching and assessment as integrated activity of understanding learner abilities by actively supporting their development, which literally means that the assessment entails the instructor or another individual providing scaffolded assistance in order for the student to complete the task as framed. In essence, the model takes issue with the fact that much of what happens in classrooms appears oriented toward helping learners to pass tests. The ostensible aim of instruction of developing intercultural competence is pushed to the background or else abstracted and reduced to what a student can perform without assistance in a given moment on a given problem. Those with kids in public school know exactly what I'm talking about. The assessment of their competence, and also for a grade in the course, is based entirely on that snapshot, and alternatively, Poner writes that the drive towards standardization and measurement that characterizes many forms of assessment is usually replaced in dynamic assessment with descriptive profiles of learner development. And I actually thought in hindsight I should have done my whole talk about just the assessment, because there's so much to say about this and think through. Lantoff and Poner appropriately cite Feuerstein when they assert that what is at stake is not theoretical elegance, but issues that affect the lives and destinies of real people. I find this framework for teaching and assessing together very exciting, if also daunting in terms of curriculum design and validity. And here I would use ecological validity as the primary measure, because crucially it links assessment to the contingent, real-world nature of intercultural communication, meaning-making, and the sorts of subjective transformations implied by the dynamic definition of intercultural competence that I established earlier. The learner and user of language interacting with people in the world is in fact never alone, faced with grappling with displaying some fixed sort of competence without assistance in a social vacuum, as it were. This doesn't mean that intercultural encounters will be scaffolded in a way that leads to a positive outcome, which is presumably what teachers want to effect in the classroom. Intercultural competence is constructed in the moment, rooted in the context and functions of the interaction between people, whether positive, negative, fraught with larger social or political implications, or banal, exciting, or boring. It stands to reason that an assessment model based on this understanding of intercultural communication and competence would help learners very well to engage with complexity, tolerate ambiguity, and connect form as meaning inextricably. So while I've only begun working this out in the framework of the courses that we offer in my institution in Irvine, and in my case, this is the second year intermediate course in which we're trying to work this out, which mediates intercultural learning through literary imagination, I would call your attention to Liddicoat and Scarino's treatment of assessing intercultural competence, organized around conceptualizing the term in situated context. To sum up, I'm going to stop now because you're about to raise the stop sign. Yeah. To sum up this too brief treatment that I would love to have an hour for, the way to approach assessing intercultural learning and competence in an instructed setting requires the same sort of dynamic approach we take to conceptualizing the intercultural competence itself, and to designing curriculum and teaching practice accordingly. It entails a range of dynamic, qualitative, formative, and summative assessments that can, in essence, triangulate to help instructors observe and validly assess learners' differential development of this difficult concept. Thank you.